Tirthankar, you are live. You may start.
Good evening, one and all, and welcome to the launch ceremony of the NSE SES reports on board composition and remuneration. Corporate governance helps build a healthy and transparent relationship amongst different stakeholders of a company, enables building of sustainable businesses, and fosters a culture of integrity and accountability among its stakeholders. In this context, it is the board of a company that ensures the adoption of the principles of corporate governance and their practice. It is therefore imperative that the board of a company has appropriate representation in terms of diversity, independence, skill set, and is compensated suitably for its role. The reports today look at trends and patterns in board composition and remuneration of the Nifty 500 universe of companies. Today's program will also include a detailed panel discussion on these reports by leading corporate governance and market
recording in progress.
I am Tirthankar Patnaik of National Stock Exchange, and may I now request Mr. Ravi Varanasi, our Group President and Chief Business Development Officer, to deliver his welcome address and start today's session. Over to you, Ravi.
Thank you, Tirthankar. Shri S.K. Mohanty, full-time member SEBI, Shri J.N. Gupta, MD SES, our panelists for today, other distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening to all of you. I welcome all of you to today's launch of SES's report on board and corporate governance practices at the hands of Shri Mohanty. Transparency, fairness, and accountability, as Tirthankar has mentioned, are foundation for building sustainable businesses for corporations in the modern world. Prudent corporate governance norms and practices that reconcile interests of all stakeholders have become the basic hygiene for delivering sustainable financial performance in the long run. There has been a marked increase in the focus of investor community on governance practices of corporations as one of the key factors that generate alpha on their investments. The growing interest of investors in corporate governance is being reflected in the growth of ESG investments globally. The framework of corporate governance has evolved over the years through stakeholder consultations, committee recommendations, and several amendments to regulations that have emphasized the role of board in promoting the integrity and transparency in a corporation's dealings and in guiding the corporation towards sustainable future. Stock exchanges play a vital role in encouraging the corporate governance practices and that strengthen the integrity of the markets. And obviously the focus is on building investor confidence. The regulatory function of stock exchanges include monitoring of compliance and disclosure requirements as laid down by the regulators, as well as by stock exchanges themselves for listed companies, trading members, investors. Beyond this traditional mandate of monitoring the companies and the trading activity, NSE encourages discussions among practitioners, academia, and with the regulators on policies and best practices that go beyond the current requirements. We believe that such interventions have over the years contributed in a small way to the development of corporate governance practices in Indian markets. NSE also encourages academic research in corporate governance area through collaborations with educational institutions and think tanks. We have been engaging with various educational institutions in this context. I once again welcome all of you to today's event, considering that we have stalwart like Shri Mohanty and great report and presentation from SES under the able leadership of Mr. Gupta, followed by a star-studded panel. I would stop here. I hope all of you will find today's deliberations useful and will have some insightful takeaways. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ravi. And now may I invite Mr. Gupta and his team for the presentation on these reports, please. Mr. Gupta, over to you.
Thank you very much, NSE. And I welcome Mr. Mohanty as well from SEBI. And I have mastered the art of delegation and taking no responsibility. So I will ask my colleagues Aditi and Navneet to do the presentation and carry on. Aditi, please.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Aditi from SES, and along with me, I have Navneet Desai, my colleague, who will be providing you a presentation on report on board composition and board remuneration of Nifty 500 entities. Next slide, please. So the study that we have done is broadly split into two parts, board composition and board remuneration. I'll be giving a brief presentation on the board composition. We had done similar study for 3 years in 2017 also, where the data was for 3 years ending at 2016-17. And a similar study has been done now from 2017-18 to 2019-20. In our study, there were 486 companies. We had excluded public sector banks from the study since they are not companies within the Companies Act and the directors don't have a DIN number. So to reduce data distortion, we have excluded PSBs. The comparison we have done is across Indian corporates versus MNCs versus PSUs and the board composition within these three ownership categories. This time we have also done a study across the broad indexes, that is Nifty 50, Next 50, mid caps versus small caps, which was not part of our earlier study. Moving on. So I'll be going over some major findings of our report for board composition. In the board size, as you can see in the table, the average number of board members over a period of 6 years from 14-15 to 19-20 have reduced by 30 basis points. That is from 9.53 members to 9.23 members. Average board strength in PSU remained at 9.82 and was highest as Nifty 50, that is at around 11 members. Again, average board size across indexes, you can see within the average board size in Nifty 50 was the highest, and thereon with every index it has reduced. On an average, board size has remained around the same from 17-18 to 2019-20 across Indian corporates and MNCs. However, in case of PSUs, you can see there's a fall from 11.2 to 9.8 in 2019-20. Now, board independence and what has been the compliance and progress from a previous study to our study in 2020. So in September 2017 data, we found that 9 Indian corporates were non-compliant when it came to the board independence requirement. This number had fallen to 5 companies in according to September 2020 data. In September 2017, we didn't find any MNC which was non-compliant with requirements of IDs. However, in September 2020, there was 1 company. The names of the companies are on your screen: Yes Bank, Hindustan Zinc, Petronet, Tasty Bite, Gujarat Fluorochemicals within Indian corporates, and in MNCs, it was Greenwell Norton. In PSUs, the non-compliance has increased. In September 2017, we had around 64% companies which were non-compliant with requirements of IDs. This has further increased to now around 74% of the PSUs which were part of our study that had a non-compliant board with requirement of independent directors. Tenure of independent directors. We can see broadly that the tenure of independent directors across Nifty 50 and even Nifty 500 index has reduced. So the tenure, which was around 8 years or around 8.5 years in 2017-18, has reduced to around 7 years in 2019-20. The tenure in PSU remains the lowest. This is a list of 10 directors with the longest association in the company. In that, on top, we have Mr. Rajendra Ambalal Shah, who has been a director for almost 56 years in PNG Hygiene and Healthcare Limited. Separation of board chairmanship position. In 2017-18, we observed that around 40% of the companies has had ED as a chairman, whereas in 19-20, we observed that only 36% of the companies have ED as a chairman. So there has been a slight reduction in ED chairmanship positions. The highest number of ED chairmen were found in small cap companies at 41% and lowest in Nifty Next 50 at 26%. When coming to PSU companies, 84% of the PSU companies still have executive director as a chairperson. In FY20, we observed that 12 companies have changed their chairman from ED to NED. Moving on gender diversity. So in a previous study, we observed in 14-15 that when it comes to gender diversity, on an average, there were 11.54 women directors, which has increased to 16.68 in 2019-20. There's been an improvement in gender diversity across all the years and across all the different types, that is Indian corporate, foreign MNCs. However, in case of PSUs, there has been a slight reduction from which was 13.2 in 17-18 has reduced to now 10.79 in FY 2019-20. So in Nifty 50, there was we found a higher gender diversity ratio, which is at 19% compared to Nifty Next 50 at 16%. Top 3 sectors for gender diversity were pharma, then IT and FMCG. There were 4 companies that were non-compliant with minimum requirement of 1 women independent director on the board, out of which 1 was an MNC and 3 were Indian corporates. On educational qualification of directors, there has been a wide improvement. In 17-18, we had around 40% of the directors which were highly qualified. When I say highly qualified, includes that these directors have postgraduate, doctorate or professional equivalent. And in 2019, there were around 74% of the directors who were highly qualified. In executive directors, professional EDs were more, 73% of the professional EDs were highly qualified compared to 43% when it comes to executive director who are promoters. Within the women directors, 86% of the women IDs were highly qualified compared to 61% of non-independent women directors. And within the independent directors categories, men plus women IDs, we had 82% who were highly qualified. Expertise diversity, the graph depicts the expertise distribution across 3619 individuals. And as you can see, the top 5 fields of expertise are either administration management, banking, finance, marketing, legal, accounts, audit, and taxation. Age profile of directors. So with it, in average age, we can see that women directors average is increased from 55 to 57 over the past 3 years. However, when it comes to men directors, it remains unchanged at 61. Average age of independent directors is 64. Average directors age in Nifty 50 is higher compared to, as you can see with Nifty Next 50, mid cap and small cap, whether it is men directors or women directors, Nifty 50 tend to be higher in terms of average age of directors. And average entry age of directors on the board, in case of executive director promoters was 30. However, in case of executive directors, non-promoters was 41. From our previous study in 2017, where the average entry age was around 38, it has reduced to 30 in case of EDPs, that is executive director promoters, and in case of non-promoters, again it has reduced from 50 to 41. Similar trend is observed when it comes to non-executive director promoters and non-promoters, whereas the promoter non-executive directors entry age was around 36, in non-promoters it was 45. Time commitments and basically taking into account the listed directorships. In Nifty 50, the listed number of listed directorship of directors on an average was around 2.57. And compared to a Nifty 500 index, it was 2.12. In case of PSUs, the listed directorship is much lesser at 1.3. Directorship in Nifty 50 Inc. have the highest time commitment, and small cap has the lowest time commitment at 1.95. Moving on. I'm sorry, I'm observing some glitch in the presentation. Yeah, okay. So time commitment across index. Again, here you can see that we have done a comparison of all the indexes, Nifty 50, Nifty Next 50, mid cap and small cap, and the time commitments of directors in different categories, EDs, NEDs, and IDs. As you can see that going from Nifty 50 to Nifty small cap, the time commitments have reduced in case of IDs, it is 2.67 in Nifty 50 and 2.17 in Nifty small cap. Looking at this data, the question that arises is there actually a dearth of independent directors? Is it a myth or a reality? Again, we took the data of all the listed directorship of directors and observed that in total, around 70% of the directors hold only one directorship position in Nifty 500 index companies. There are only 4% of the directors who hold more than 5 directorships. Now I'll hand over the presentation to Navneet.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Now, moving on to the board remuneration report. Firstly, the study showed that the board remuneration versus PAT, the study showed that even though on an absolute basis, the average remuneration did not see much change in the past 3 years, but as a percentage to net profits, average remuneration did witness fluctuations. So this leads us to an interesting question of whether remuneration is indeed tied to net profits of companies. Now, overall, board remuneration to net profits increased from 1.7% to 2.4% in the past 6 years. Among indices, Nifty 50 companies drew highest average board remuneration and lowest average percentage to net profits. Small cap companies drew a lowest average board remuneration and highest average percentage to net profits during FY 19-20. During the past 6 years, the increase in average remuneration across all 3 categories of directors has been between 30 to 40%. In case of EDs, the average increased from 3.9 to 5.4 crores. In case of NEDs, the increase is from 24 lakhs to 32 lakhs. And in case of IDs, the average has moved from 13 lakhs to 18 lakhs. Now, coming to gender equality in remuneration, there has been a significant improvement in case of professional EDs in the past 3 years, apart from IDs. However, in case of non-promoter women, non-executive directors, the gap has rather increased from 49% in 17-18 to 58% in FY 19-20. In case of promoter EDs, the position has worsened. The gap has increased from 20% to 27% during the same period. However, the story is reversed in case of promoter women non-executive directors, where the gap has reduced and yet is the highest amongst all categories. Now, coming to promoter and non-promoter pay, with a significant majority of Indian companies being family-run, this table establishes that ownership does play a significant role in remuneration practices across all indices. Across 3 years, family-owned companies have been paying a higher remuneration, although on the face of it, the gap is reducing. Nifty 50 pay highest remuneration in absolute terms and lowest versus PAT. This reverses as we move towards the lower end of the spectrum. Now, coming to stock option schemes of companies, the number of companies having stock options have increased from 18% to 26% in the past 3 years. Across indices, it is seen that ESOP giving companies are lowest in percentage terms for Nifty small cap and highest in Nifty 50 in both Indian companies and MNCs. This indicates that higher the market cap, higher is the chance that ESOP is part of the compensation plan. Between Indian companies and MNCs, although the number of MNCs offering stock option plans are comparatively lesser. However, the ESOP value is quite significant in case of MNCs compared to Indian companies during FY 19-20. Now, coming to the board remuneration with respect to median remuneration of employee as a ratio, this ratio is seen highest in the construction sector and lowest in the IT companies. Now, the top 5 companies with the highest average ED remuneration to the median remuneration of employees can be seen in this table. Moving on. With respect to pure employee compensation, the median remuneration of employees, MNCs have a better pay scale for employees, where the MRE was 10.8 lakhs compared to Indian companies where the MRE was only 6.5 lakhs. Now, with respect to the promoter ED remuneration, 175 promoter executive directors were paid remuneration in excess of 5 crores. 85 promoter executive directors breached the individual limit of 2.5% of net profits of 5 crores, which is higher. That's the SEBI requirement under LODR. And 53 companies breached this total EDP limit. Now, Now we compare the promoter executive director versus the professional ED remuneration. There's no ED in the MNC drawing a remuneration over 25 crores, while there are 26 EDs in the Indian category. No non-promoter executive can be seen in more than 50 crores category. However, 4 promoter executive directors are drawing remuneration in excess of 50 crores. Overall, the assessment indicates that the remuneration is in favor of promoter EDs, except in the Nifty 50 category. In the next 50 category, not much of the difference is seen between the promoter EDs and the non-promoter EDs if one looks at the total number in the last volume. Now, we come to the non-executive director remuneration. Here, the average range was between 32 to 35 lakhs for the past 5 years, which was roughly 0.5% of the PAT. Average remuneration of the non-executive, non-independent directors for Indian companies were 5 to 6 times higher than the MNC counterparts. Now, the male non-executive, non-independent directors were paid 3 to 4 times higher than their women counterparts. We come to the non-executive NED remuneration as companies which have a higher NED directors who had more than 50% of the total NED pay. As you can see from the table, the first 3 rows, 48 NEDs received remuneration exceeding 50% of the total NED pay of the board during FY 1920. Now we come to the pay skewness of the NED chairperson. The remuneration of the non-executive, non-independent chair was around at an average of 1.08 crores compared to 17 lakhs for the non-chair, non-executive directors. Remuneration of the promoter non-executive chairperson was 2.6 times that of the non-executive, non-independent, non-promoter chair during FY 1920. Coming to the average ID remuneration, you see that there is no significant difference in the ID remuneration when we compare the Indian companies and the MNCs. However, with respect to the average remuneration between the 3 categories, you can see that the highest is for the non-executive, non-independent directors, then the non-executive, non-independent, non-promoter directors, and then the IDs. We come to the ID pay as a percentage of PAT. Firstly, the range of ID remuneration was between 17 to 19 lakhs for the past 3 years. 147 IDs received remuneration which was greater than 50 lakhs. Out of this, 45 IDs received a remuneration greater than 1 crore. And the table shows the companies that did not pay any remuneration to the IDs. Next, we come to the gender in case of ID. But on an average, there was no major differentiation between across the indices between the male and the female. Lastly, the highest paid IDs. This list has a decent mix of gender, with 4 women IDs also making it to the list. The list contains 1 politically exposed persons, 3 retired bank chairpersons, 2 MNC bank former senior executives, and 1 former regulator. So this concludes the remuneration portion of the study. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aditi and Navneet. Back to Tirthankar.
Thank you, Mr. Gupta. Ladies and gentlemen, now that we've had a taste of both the reports, let me now request our full-time member, Mr. S.K. Mohanty, to kindly unveil the report along with Ravi Varanasi, our president. Since it's an online program, the marketing department will run an AV, which will show us the reports unveiling. After that, may I request Mr. Mohanty to speak a few words, please. Saurabh? Thank you. Thanks a lot, Saurabh, for that. May I now request Mr. Mohanty to speak a few words, please?
Yeah. Thank you, Tirthankar, Gupta ji, Mr. Shroff, Ravi Varanasi ji, and all other dignitaries, whoever is now logged on to this program. A very good evening, and in fact, it's a very happy occasion, and I'm feeling very, very privileged to be part of this ceremony. This is a very, very in-depth empirical work that I have seen on various dimensions of corporate governance. We talk about corporate governance sometime in bits and pieces here and there, picking up some data points here and there. And as I can see from the report, I had a very cursory look at the report, and I find more than 5 lakh data points have been analyzed by Gupta ji and his team. And as far as Mr. Jayan Gupta is concerned, I know him how much, I mean, you can say very, very passionate about this subject of corporate governance. Almost he carries corporate governance on his sleeve. I've seen him talking vociferously and very passionately about every aspect of corporate governance in all the PMAC meetings. So I think NSE has entrusted this work to the right person to do this job. And in fact, I can find the some of the kind of hard work that has gone into this report. So many data points and so many aspects. And now we can say we have statistics and figures and a lot of granular data to support us whenever we will be confronted with any policy making part, or to try to do something about improving corporate governance in the listed companies. We have this database to equip ourselves in a better manner, and especially of course, SEBI doesn't get into much into remuneration part, other than trying to find out how to ensure that the independence can be maintained. PMAG had already recommended that they can be incentivized in terms of either ESOP or some kind of profit linked share remuneration, etc., which I think we are still in dialogue with MCA. But apart from that, the kind of analysis that has been done about the educational background, the age, and the number of companies having independent directors. And interestingly, of course, one can find that the educational background, the qualification have gone up tremendously high. You are having a lot of domain experts in the area of corporate, I mean, in the boards to protect the interests of the minority shareholders. At the same time, I think people are interested to get into the board of the companies only after retirement age is over. Sometimes 63, 64, they're entering into it, and not before that. And so many other interesting data points I just saw in the presentation. And definitely going forward, these data points, this report is going to serve as a very good guiding document for all of us in our primary market advisory committee, and otherwise also internally in SEBI discussion forums to serve us better in taking good policy decisions. I just wish NSE to ensure that this report gets updated every year with yearly figures. And now I think we can even aspire to get March 21 or next, I mean, after a few months, March 22 will come, so that at any point of time we are always updated with the latest statistics, latest statistical analysis. Tirthankar can take it forward from NSE side. And with this, I just again congratulating NSE and this proxy advisory firm SES, which has been doing very good work in the field of investor empowerment. And both these agencies, NSE and this agency, they have come out with a beautiful document. And I have already forwarded this soft copy to the entire, most of our officers, whoever are dealing with corporate management and investors, these governance aspects of the companies. So I wish all the best to NSE again for conducting this kind of activities, research activities and surveys, and a lot more can be done. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Mr. Mohanty, for your kind words. You may please stay on for the panel discussion, sir, at your convenience.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me now welcome you to the panel discussion that will inevitably follow. The report did raise several important questions, and to look at some of these questions and examine them in greater detail, I'm glad to introduce you to really, as Ravi pointed out, a star-studded panel. We have Mr. Cyril Shroff, who will be the moderator of this panel. We have Mr. Swaroop Mohanty, CEO, Mirae Asset India. We have Mr. J.N. Gupta. He'll be on the panel. Of course, sir, you have to answer for all the questions that will be raised in the report. We have Mr. Amit Tripathi. He's the CIO Fixed Income from Nippon India. We have Ms. Priya Subramanian, the Chief Regulatory Officer of NSE India. And we have Mr. Umakant Barotin, Professor of Law, NUS. So over to you, Mr. Shroff.
Thank you, Tirthankar. And also thank you, Mr. Mohanty, Ravi, and Mr. Gupta. I've been also a kind of a student and disciple of the theme of corporate governance for a long time. And I've seen dramatic improvements over the, let's say, roughly the 9 to 10 years since the New Companies Act of 2013. There have been so many seminal evolutions, whether it's how LODR evolved, the Kotak Committee, periodic updations to related party rules or conflicts of interest, and now the whole migration to BRSR from the BRR regime as well. So this is an ongoing story that is developing. There is no finishing line to this, and it's great that SES is producing this high quality research based on hard data, because I think apart from the qualitative and the conceptual conversations that take place, it's good that these conversations are grounded on actual data. So it's a incredible piece of work that has been done by SES and NSE, and my congratulations to them. It's a privilege to moderate this excellent panel. And Tirthankar, since you have already introduced the panelists, I will not take up more time on that. And happy to dive in right into the discussions. I know we have roughly about 45 minutes, including followed by Q&A. So I'm going to start first with Umakant and Priya with the first question on. I'm going to divide the whole conversation into 4 parts. First is on board composition and various facets of it. Then I want to have a discussion around the quality of governance. I'd like to, as a third topic or theme, I would like to talk about ESG, and lastly about compensation, and then kind of whatever else comes up. These conversations can go on for a whole day, because it's an constantly evolving subject. So first question to Umakant and Priya, and taking stock and taking a kind of a view of the whole journey. How would you evaluate the progress amongst listed companies over the last decade on the structural aspects of board composition and the actual impact on governance? I think some of the answers may have been provided by the report and the data that we just saw, but I'd love to get your take.
Thanks. Priya, would you like to go, or should I?
No, Umakant, please start.
Okay. Thanks, Mr. Shroff. And I would echo Mr. Shroff's congratulations regarding the report. It's a very, very useful tool to understand the implications of how corporate governance has developed ever since the Companies Act and the LODR regulations were revamped. So the way I look at the report and the findings of the report at a macro level is, to me, it seems like the overall findings suggested that the law actually works. So the Companies Act and the LODR have laid down a set of rules. And what we see in this report is that companies are slowly coagulating towards compliance with the rules by and large. So whatever is the minimum that is laid down by the law is something that companies have by and large complied with. So maybe the law as a regulatory nudge has worked at a broad level, if that was if what we see the law as the desirable set of corporate governance norms. So that's number one. So that's the good thing about what we see in corporate governance. The second thing is, can we do more? So I think that the question is are these findings suggesting that the companies are doing the bare minimum that the law requires? Why should the companies not do more? So in the future, are we going to be seeing corporate governance driven only by what the regulation says? Or is there an innate sense of governance that companies would choose to, irrespective of whether the law requires them to do or not? So I think that part seems a little bit of a work in progress as far as we are concerned. So hopefully in the future years, we'll see companies overperforming on these parameters as opposed to meeting just the minimum required. And the third part is I find a little disappointing is we see still outliers and defaulters. So even the minimum is something that some companies have not complied with. And unfortunately, we see that it's the PSUs that are on top of this list. This is something which has been an issue which is going on for the last almost 15, 20 years. I know that SEBI, I think around 2006 or 2007, actually issued notices to PSU saying that you're not complying with board independence and other norms, but somewhere along the line that kind of fell by the wayside. So that issue still continues to be there. So how do we bring these outliers and defaulters into the picture, and how do we ensure that there are no dual set of norms, one that applies to non-PSUs and one that applies to PSUs? I think that's a standout issue that we see from this report. So I think broadly three takes. One is there's a good news that minimum compliance is broadly there. Second, can we do more in the future, or are the companies going to gravitate only to what the law requires? And third is, how do we deal with the defaulters? I think these are the broad issues that came out with, to me, from this report and the two reports so far.
So taking off from where what Umakant said, for me, one thing is, and this was referred to a little previously as well, the director's job still seems to be a little bit like a retirement, profile. To me, that's disappointing because what it seems to suggest is not that you can't contribute. The point is, I think you need to step into a director's job a little earlier. I would certainly like to see that. As Umakant said, very clearly there has been a compliance, a lot more compliance than what was there a few years ago. From a percentage perspective, both from a quality and content, and the number of filings. So, for example, we've gone from 85% to almost 96 to 98% in terms of filings. And we are also looking at the content. Our team has seen that the content also has improved. Before we used to find, not applicable in a bunch of columns. Now people are actually taking the trouble to put on some good content. The other part, which frankly seems to be disappointing, especially as a woman, is that, everybody had a woman director, and that is now translated to woman independent director. But nobody is actually, very, very few companies have actually taken the trouble to have one woman director and a woman independent director. The numbers bear out. So to that extent, I think there's a lot more that corporates can certainly do from a broader, governance perspective. In terms of, you also asked about impact on governance. Clearly, I think there is at least anecdotally, there's a change, because we've got much more qualified directors. Some of the statistics were placed before this audience. So certainly, from a quality perspective, from the fact that there are more independent directors, I would think that clearly there has been a change. But some of these things, certainly, I think we can do more. A broader PSU perspective, it's a little bit problematic, because if you think about, if you go down the chain, what we do first is obviously have a fine, a penalty, and then there is moving the scrip to trade for trade, which by itself will be very, very significant action. Then is promoter shares. I'm not particularly sure NSE can actually go and, any exchange or SEBI for that matter, can go and freeze Government of India shares. I think that will be a very different kind of action. So therefore, the next question is, what can we do? I mean, apart from write letters and try and nudge the government and PSUs, our committee actually asked this question very recently, that, are we actually saying that the PSU shareholders deserve less than what the other company shareholders do? I didn't have an answer. I will open this to this panel and this audience to guide me. Thanks, Cyril.
So no, thanks for that, Priya. And one take I have also listening to all of this and hearing the report as well is it kind of confirms my belief that sort of Indian corporate culture is a very rule-based culture rather than a principle-based culture, which is why you have this this whole philosophy of whatever is minimum required, let's get it done. Let's not try to either over comply. दूसरे कोई नहीं कर रहे तो मुझे करने की क्या जरूरत है? Barring a few companies as well. So that's the philosophy of just follow the law. And I'll come when I talk about the second theme on the quality of governance. I'll pick that up in more detail. But our whole regulatory and policy architecture has been essentially designed around a rule-based society as well. And it has worked. I think as Umakant said that at least the evidence shows that all these regulations and the changes in the Companies Act and LODR have certainly moved the needle from what it was a decade ago and now. There is tangible proof and evidence that there has been progress in the journey. The quality of the progress we will come to separately. Now let me sort of change gear a bit and let me talk of the kind of new age listed companies, namely the unicorns, and we're seeing so many of them. They are a little different from the traditional company as they have, generally speaking, with a few exceptions, much lower promoter holdings and much greater institutional shareholding. And that's partly also the history of how they develop, and they've given away large chunks of their equity to VC PE funds. On the eve of the IPO, they would bring in anchor investors and things like that. So the founder continues as a kind of a smaller shareholder. In theory, continues in many cases as the quote-unquote promoter when you look at it from a SEBI lens, but not with the kind of overwhelming ratios, ownership ratios that you're used to kind of for want of a better word, the old-fashioned companies. So these companies are supposed to be board controlled, these new companies, but their stake is either low or on the decline. Also, this is being now embedded in regulatory and policy philosophy as well. For example, in May 21, SEBI put out kind of a consultation paper and invited comments on almost recharacterizing promoters into persons in control, and they took note of this trend of the declining, holding levels of promoters. So my question to Swaroop and Amit, representing the kind of institutional world, is what does this really mean for governance? And as a linked question, since we draw a lot of our capital markets inspiration from the West, is that are we headed towards a kind of a US style board controlled companies paradigm? Is it a reality, or are we going to land in the space in between where the promoter holding is weak for the reason that I mentioned, but we still haven't moved to powerful boards, which actually are the source of power in the company? So where are we headed from an accountability framework? Well, what's your take on this? Swaroop?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Shroff. See, when I look at the report, a lot of things are evident by seeing the report itself. I mean, when you look at the perceived notion of category of or a type of a promoter and how a promoter behaves is coming out by the adherence or deviation to some basic norms in the categories. An MNC is supposed to behave in a certain manner is a perceived notion. When you see the outcome, it is following that pattern. A promoter-driven organization behaves in a certain way and a PSU behaves in a certain way. It's very stark if you look at the numbers. And that is how it will play out. And I'm actually happy that, when you see the numbers, a lot of things echo in your mind. But again, you brought out this very interesting aspect of the new age companies completely behaving differently. And what is being recognized is the shareholding pattern going forward. If you have the right names, a lot changes for you, for your own fortunes, and then the final nail will come.
But I want to push you back. Does it really change? Because I'm going to have a second round of questions really on what is the culture of these new age companies.
Forget. I mean, let me explain myself as a bright example. We are a South Korean company sitting in India, and when you look at the board actually is independent because there is absolutely no link between me and my board. I didn't even know them. We went and recruited them through recruitment firms, just establishing the fact that they have to be independent, and this is something which has come top down. Right, and that's something which a foreign company typically tends to practice. See, Mr. Shroff, you will agree, and I think Umakant was also referring to it, is that the difference between a good business and a sustainable business is governance at the end of the day. And that will play out, and what we are seeing now, the discussion of governance itself is at a different level. The recognition of us as funds within the shareholding or the involvement of funds within the various company meetings, the acknowledgement of changes within the meeting is getting serious. Let's face some facts that, earlier we as institutes played a very insignificant part in the holding pattern. But now as our holding becomes serious, we start getting involved in those meetings. Earlier it was not so. And there is definitely a regulatory push towards that. You can make no mistake on that. The good part of this whole thing and it's a laid fact that we aim at minimum adherence, but when that is at play, I do believe that this minimum adherence threshold will continue to compound from a regulatory perspective. That's my personal opinion. Of course, Mr. Mohanty is here. He can be the right person to it, but we are seeing an upward trend on it. And more so, I think we will discuss that in the later stage when the ESG part seriously takes over in this country. We will see that dramatic change or that J curve that happening.
But, I think the reason in sort of Indian corporate culture is that compliance or good governance is a regulatory-driven conversation still. It's not a market-driven conversation yet. And we are in the process of migrating from, because of the change in ownership patterns or the gradual change in ownership patterns, I think we are somewhere in the midpoint of the journey from sort of regulatory-driven policy to market-driven policy. And when that happens, I think that's when you'll see the change. And it will converge with ESG as well.
But it has begun to happen. Look at us. We were practically non-entities in the voting pattern earlier. 5-6 years earlier, not very far away. Today, we are very serious voters though there is an external advisor to almost all of us.
But you didn't answer my question on the new age company, the unicorns.
Yeah, so that is what is the difference. Look at the difference between a lot of these unicorns are the first stage businessmen, unlike the previous promoters, which were like, a dynastic sort of rule. So the way they will approach a lot of them, their education itself is very new age. So the way they will approach business might not have any correlation with the way India behaved in the past is my submission. Stark difference. And we are already seeing that happening.
Fair enough. But at the same time, you also run the risk of a lot of hubris, because you can have a 27, 20 or 8-year-old or a early 30s who suddenly from just graduating out of a IIT or IIM within 3-4 years of his career becomes a multi-billionaire, and it goes to the head. So there is there's a different type of moral hazard that we are on the threshold of.
Fair.
So I would just make an assumption that whatever is new age is necessarily better.
No, but when these new age businesses come and meet us, for say Anchor or whatever, we run a small VC firm also. The approach is tending towards governance more than.
No, I agree. So Amit, your thoughts?
So broadly agree with what Swaroop said, just adding 2 or 3 things here. One is obviously as the ownership pattern changes, the first thing that becomes very different is transparency. I guess not only the board, but the management of the company tends to be much more transparent, not only in terms of what they are doing, but also what they are thinking. I would also add, along with new age companies, all companies which are there in terms of fulfilling fiduciary, whether it is, like Swaroop mentioned, asset management companies themselves, new platform companies such as REITs, InvITs, etc., that have come through. In all these cases, the role of board and especially independent directors in that board becomes very, very paramount. And that is something that we are already seeing. So Umakant sir started by saying that, it is regulatory push to start with. That regulatory push is now becoming more and more self-sustaining and self-fulfilling is what we can see. In fact, managements themselves are now eager to have the right staffing as far as board is concerned, not only in terms of quantity, but more importantly in terms of quality. So you have domain experts now coming and sitting in the board who are supposed to give that strategic depth to the business. So it's not about just following the rules any longer. It is more about giving strategic depth. You obviously haven't reached the US levels of either shareholder activism or board activism for that part, in the sense that independent directors standing up and going against the said businesses, but you definitely are in a much better position today than what you were 5 years back.
Absolutely, and adding to the trend, to the kind of influence that both of you bring is also the kind of focus on governance that the index fund bring, like the BlackRock and the Vanguards and State Streets, and and the kind of direction and even pressure that they put on companies. The Larry Fink letter goes around and certainly has a huge persuasive value on market thinking. And then when you combine that with the recommendations that come from proxy advisors, whether they're international ones or firms like Mr. Gupta's, I think it adds up to an interesting mix. So therefore, I go back to my initial comments that I think we're in the middle of a major transition. There are kind of tectonic changes that are taking place in the whole theme of corporate governance. Before I go to the next topic, would anybody like to add anything? Umakant, Gupta ji, Priya?
Sorry, I just wanted to add one short point about new age companies, where I think governance is even more important in these cases, because the business model usually tends to be unproven. It's a new business model. So that makes it a lot more onerous for the governance to be strong, especially at the stage of listing. So for example, in the US currently, there's a lot of issues going around special purpose acquisition companies, which are typically in the new age field. So there's a lot of, which is also slowly coming to India. So I think that is one issue where governance becomes even more important.
Yeah, and also, independent boards holding CEOs to account. So it's a very public case. So we know about Uber, where the founder was thrown out. I don't know whether that will still happen in India, where if there is a toxic work culture which can be attributed to founders, will an Indian independent board behave like the board of Uber or not? Question to ponder.
Yeah, Cyril, I will add. See, when we say new age company, we understand that they do not have the 75% or 60% promoters equity. But what happened, you must understand that they are operating in the same environment where all the promoter operated companies are operating. So what is happening? Nobody wants to leave the board control. So the new age company, through their article of association, having the right to nominate directors, that as long as I own 10% or 5% or 12%, so they end up in having ability to appoint the majority of the directors. That is where the control of the board remains, despite the fact that they do not have
Correct. And that, and also, though there are not too many examples, but when you have dual class shareholding, also you will have that, where a founder with 10-15% shareholding may still have corporate control. But I think India is not there yet. It's still there in the West. And that's again, it's linked to my last question of, lower holding doesn't necessarily mean lower control. There are so many ways to skin the control cat.
Yeah.
The other point is new age companies actually get valuations which, promoter-driven companies might not even, dream about.
Dream of.
So to that extent, I think new age companies might start believing in their own myth. I think that's something which the experience of Uber.
The culture and
exactly.
How do you make sure that the new age boards stay grounded and are able to kind of not get hypnotized by their own story?
I think that's important to the extent that they
and
come
only
to.
Time will tell. Only time will tell. There will be some great successes and also some spectacular failures as well. So we will see that. That's the beauty of markets, I guess. Moving on, we're still on the board composition theme. Gupta ji, if you can just quickly share your thoughts on the split between the chairman and MD positions. You know, you and I were both on the Kotak committee, and that's where the foundations of this point was laid. But actually, SEBI carried it a step further when the LODR came out. So, are companies preparing for it, and you think it will really happen? And what changes do you see as a result of this move?
I got to say very straightforward. In India, there is always a resistance to change or resistance to any law, and whereas the regulator is always very tolerant to all those demands, they keep on accommodating. Now, what we have observed are a couple of things. One, straight away, everybody is hoping that by 1st April, the law will not come. That's why they are appointing that till 31st, I am executive chairman. If the law comes, then I will give up my position on 1st April. That is one set. The second set is, okay, I appoint my daughter or son as executive director. I become chairman emeritus. So now India Incorporated had decided one more coin, the chairman emeritus. From 2012 to 2018, we did not see any appointment of chairman emeritus. But from 2018, after the Kotak committee brought this, we have seen at least 25 appointments of chairman emeritus. Now, chairman emeritus is supposed to be a position which is not really operating or which is not participative. But most of the companies have made it a participative chairman emeritus. The third is a very minuscule people who say, okay, if that is the law, let me respect it and we separate. So there also they have separated. So maybe 8 or 10 companies have separated, genuinely believing that the law is good and done it. In India, whatever you do, we will find a way out. But I'm a born optimist, and I would say that maybe with the pressure of people like Swarup Mohanty, Amit Tripathi, and many institutional investors, the boards and the companies will see the logic of it and move forward.
No, thank you for that. And the fundamental concept is that management of the business and management of the board and ensuring proper governance are that there are really two skill sets and two functions, and they should be run separately. So I think there is definitely merit in that. But given the high level of promoter holding and the fact that at least in the old age companies, businesses are seen as dynastic assets, I think is what creates some of this. So we'll see how this evolves. Let's have another sort of catch up on 1st April and see what has changed. Last point on this theme is, this was a big question in the whole Nasli Wadia fight on, the appointment and removal of independent directors. And there was a lot of controversy around at that time of, whether an ordinary resolution itself is enough to appoint and remove an independent director. And it goes back to a fundamental principle of corporate democracy that jiska majority, jiski lathi, uski bhais. So 51% is the lathi, and the appointment or removal is the result of that. But now the change that is coming of 75 per special resolution, how do you see this actually impacting the whole paradigm of appointment and removal, and will it really result in change in the psychology of both promoters as well as independent directors? Are independent directors going to become more independent than they otherwise would have been, or less? Gupta ji, and a question for everybody on the panel, whoever wants to take it.
See, I would say, as I have been saying, that independence is character. It is a trait of individual.
नहीं तो फिर तब क्या जरूरत है? Character पे ही जाओ फिर खाली.
Yeah, so that I'm saying. So I may not require any law to support me to air my view. But the problem is this: there are various factors which come into the play. If I am looking at a job of independent director as a post-retirement job to guarantee me my same lifestyle which I was having when I was in a full-time job. Probably I would have to compromise some sense of independence. The other problem is that if a person behaves very independently in the board, he is risking not only his job in that board, but he is risking his job in other boards also. You would recall when in the Kotak committee, I asked in the open house, how many of you will want me as an independent director? And answer was universal, no. Nobody wants me as independent director. So the issue is that it is a very, very difficult balance. When I am writing,
the corporate sector was not fully represented there. So that
yeah,
is
what I'm saying is this. I know that while I write report, I criticize many people, but I may not, I can admit that maybe in their position, I would also not find a solution to it if I had some constraint. So either you have no constraint and be totally independent. Other thing I say that if 10 independent directors decides to voice their thing, probably 100 others will also get the courage, because the India Incorporated will not be able to afford removing all those top 100 or 120 directors. That will become a movement.
So what we need is a J.N. Gupta School for Independent Directors. And that is, I think, the real solution. So if I can now move on to the second broad theme, which builds on this last conversation, which is the quality of governance. So it's always been the belief, and a lot of scholars hold the view that Indian corporate governance is much more about compliance. It sort of links in with the whole minimum standards idea. And if I can kind of use a Hindi word for it, there is a lot of focus on niyam and very little on niti. Niti is a kind of spirit of governance, and it's exactly the point that you made. So Indian regulation and Indian policy is excessively focused on the niyam, and it has not found the right way of capturing the whole concept of niti. And perhaps because philosophy is not what you kind of expect to come from regulatory instruments, but how do we bring it in? So what you really need is a culture of constructive dissonance at boards. So in real life, how do we bring this into the culture of corporate conversations at boards and governance? And Guptaji, I think your last set of comments actually address that. But let me get a view from Umakant and Swaroop on how do you create this culture of dissonance? Because the idea is that you come to the right decisions. Compliance to niyam wala to ho jata hai. There's a compliance officer who's picking all the boxes. He'll give a certificate at the board saying everything is okay, and board say yes, fine. 5 minutes maybe the topic is over. But there is always a problem, and the problem is one of niti. So, question to Uma and Swaroop: how do we bring this in? What are the tools that are available for having more niti and less niyam?
To me, I think it seems like ultimately it's a question of incentives. So what are the incentives of the management and the board in the conduct in which, so how do they carry out? So as you rightly said, I don't think it's a law that can do this. It has to be something innate. It has to come from within the organization itself. And to me, the incentives are very important. And I think you've asked the question to Swaroop as well. So for example, I think depending on if no matter what the law says, if investors want more than what the law requires, if there's going to be a governance premium, which is financially,
but there is always a governance premium. Yeah, so incentives are always there, but you still have people who think that there is greater incentive in taking shortcuts.
Yeah, but again, so you mentioned the example of BlackRock. So Larry Fink's letter is a good example. So everybody was talking about ESG for so many years now. There were legislations, regulators were talking about it, policymakers were talking about it. But it's only when investors like BlackRock actually stood up and said, we now care about ESG, that we started seeing more traction from the companies innately themselves. So I think unless there is some kind of, so it could be civil society, it could be companies, it could be climate action, which we've been speaking about elsewhere. So I think unless there are those pressures, in addition to what the law brings about, I think that will also draw in a lot of the incentives. So one is something innate that comes from the company. So long as you see value in doing something.
Incentives and disincentives, both.
Incentives and disincentives, both. I think that's important. And maybe I'd be interested in hearing Swaroop's view as well, because I think investors like them will also play a very important role in inculcating those incentives within companies.
Yeah, I think I'll take it on from where Umakant is leaving it, because the environment is changing by the day. Gone are those days when you can do something and get away with it. The transparency around all of us is increasing, and everything gets noticed. The fact that there are so many companies listed in the market and bulk of the money of all the funds together are in some 70, 80 companies is step number one. And within those 70, 80 companies, it's not that it is allocated as per the index. The fund managers, the G part of the whole thing is definitely playing out. And if there's a question mark on the G, it reflects on the shareholding pattern also. And that is step number one. I think, one is regulatory, the other one is the shareholder push. And that we are seeing unfolding both on the equity side as well as on the debt side. If you ask Amit will tell you that there is a credit rating system in the country. He will have his own parallel credit rating system of the various companies, which can be completely different from what the actual pen and paper says. And a lot of that difference is what comes into the governance part of it. And today, the same promoter doing something in the market cannot come back and revisit it and think of, getting away with a lot of things that used to happen in the past, because it was pretty opaque. So from the transparency perspective, one, obviously there is a regulatory action in everything, but just keep the regulatory aspect out of it. It is the demonstration of the governance which will reflect very heavily on the consistency of shareholding of large institutions. That is a fact. And any deviation from that will reflect in the depletion of shareholding. That goes unsaid. I mean, there is no doubt or debate on this going forward. Yes, Mr. Gupta said some things about, things happening in the future. I do agree that there will come a time when the shareholders will start acting, and that time is not very far away, because the money is involved that the institutions bring to the table in the form of shareholding is getting serious. Just a small fact, I mean, today on the equity side, we bring in 10,000 crores per month on the SIP side, and that is significantly increasing our position as shareholders in all these companies. And that is here to stay, and make no mistake that the internal trustees and the internal directors are very cognizant of this fact, and we get questioned on this. It is no longer just at a fund management level. It is internally discussed in the investment committees. Of course, any deviation, we are very sure that the regulator pulls up. We get no leeway from the regulator. Let me make it very clear on this. And that's the way it should be, because we run a fiduciary role. So next 5 years, if we were to discuss this same position from an pure India perspective, I would say that there would be dramatic change in the way we, the institutional shareholders, bring this aspect into recognition in the Indian corporates.
So, may I add something?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
No, so essentially, just to take off from where Swaroop said, I think markets know and markets punish. We've seen that in spreads of AAA corporates, the difference in the spreads. We've also seen many anecdotal, companies where their peers are ranked or valued very differently. And, to that extent, I think the market seems to understand where the governance is high and where it's not so much. How, I don't know, but that certainly seems to be the case. The broader perspective, I also want to make the point that if we see board papers today, I mean, let's just think about it. You get agenda papers of 1,500 pages. It seems to be that companies are actually flooding their boards with that amount of paperwork. Where is there going to be a conceptual discussion, unless it's at a separate strategy session or something of that sort? You mentioned Indians. Maybe we start off learning by rote, and then go on to, you please tell me what I should do. I will do only that much and no more. And then at the next stage, let us inform anything and everything that goes on in our company, so that nobody holds us tomorrow responsible for not having said something. So the board meetings take 3 days. At the end of it, if you expect board members who are independent directors, not necessarily who understand the basics or the nitty-gritty, to actually ask conceptual questions, it's everybody needs to change. I don't think, you know, this is something that one person or one set of people can make a change and it will happen. I think it needs to be across the board.
So something, Swaroop, you mentioned, and it was going to be my next question anyway. And I'm not going to take any names, but these are some of the, you know, the discussions that are going on in newspapers every day. Is you know, the actual ability for investors to exercise corporate control and supervision over managers, promoters as well. And it's so easy. And again, you know, maybe my profession is partly to blame. It is so easy to you know, abuse the legal system to actually defeat or delay corporate democracy. And when you look, because, you know, folks like you invest in so many different markets, how do you see this sort of playing out in the near to short term? Is corporate, you know, the source of your theoretical power is your ownership and shareholding, and when you act as a group of institutional investors, you can do anything. वो ऐसे भी नहीं होता है. Because Indian system में, I mean, there may be aberrations and exceptions, but it is possible to defeat or delay. So how do institutional investors view this?
So if I were to give our example, say for us, we run 2 books. One is the global book, which has its own say on India Incorporated, and we have the local Indian book. And whenever we deviate, there is a view from the global book rectifying us or putting us, their view, rectifying is not the right word, but they come in and give their view on the same script or the same company. Yeah. So from a present perspective, you know, it might look that there is a deviation. And the deviation at times, you know, down the market cap is pretty large. Again, I bring back my simple point is that, you know, some of us now own 3-4% of the market cap of those companies. And in a fiduciary role, we are accountable for that. I mean, make no mistake, we will be questioned, and we are questioned every now and then on our holding, everything. And then in this transparent world, if we are accountable to our investors, then we have to do good that job of this fiduciary capacity. And then
earlier, are you willing to turn activist for it? Otherwise, it's just a paper sword.
No, so, but it is happening. I mean, no, Mr. Shroff, if you see, and I don't want to again get into any names, fact is the shareholder, like I mean, Priya rightfully said, there is a market which recognizes that. There is either a discount or a premium to that in the market. And that is reflected. And then that it is just a matter of time that India Incorporated, and the fair amount of cognizance of that is already happened. If there is superior governance, it will be recognized by this, and hence the result will be this is already under consideration. And that differentiation is already there. The fact that India, I mean, the institutions only invest in 80, 90 stocks is already recognition of fair amount of thresholds for these to happen. And once you go down 100 in market cap, this scrutiny is even more from the institutions. Is a reality.
Good. Amit, you want to add anything?
Yeah, if I can add here, I think the stewardship code has added a lot of teeth to this entire exercise. And if you actually look at the principles that the stewardship code brings in, one that is very, very apparent already is the proxy voting. And you can actually see institutional shareholders coming together in many instances and vociferously putting forth their view on certain aspects. The presence of independent bodies which actually guide on those actions and give their independent views is also putting that much more pressure both on institutional investors as well as on the management and promoters of these companies. So I guess stewardship code is in that sense part of what is enabling this kind of activism. We are possibly also already on the process of incorporating ESG into fair valuation. So the point that was made earlier, whether it is in terms of share price or whether it is in terms of corporate bond spreads, the fact that down below at the research analyst level, you have ESG incorporated to the fair valuation itself means that you have that activism right where it hurts, right, in terms of the price and the action and the demand that the institution is showing.
Absolutely, and that takes me directly into the third theme of the day, which is ESG. And as you rightly said, ESG is now mainstream. It's now no longer just a compliance function. Section 166 of our Companies Act effectively says it's a board responsibility. And recently, our Supreme Court has also ruled that all stakeholders are at a par. The purpose of the company is not only to work for shareholders but for all stakeholders. So, Mr. Gupta and Swaroop, how would you evaluate? What would your observations be on the level of ESG awareness at boards? Is it still compliance, or is it truly becoming more broadly mainstream?
Swaroop, after you.
No, Mr. Gupta, first you give your findings, then I will give my basic, because, okay, since you said, let me start. First of all, Mr. Shroff, whenever we discuss ESG in the market, people still feel it's a theme or a fad. The reality of ESG is yet to sink out among India in a broad way, that this is serious, this is real. The difference being, if you look at the European side or the, more matured market, the ESG was more, investor driven. There was a fair amount of push from the investors to enact on this. Maybe those countries have been affected more for the average person to be in knowledge of this. But here it is institution driven down to the others. So there's a clear difference between...
No, here the push comes from regulation.
Yeah, but...
regulation, then and then finally the market. So we are still not at the third stage.
But if you look at what's happening in India, there is absolutely no mistake on this, that the regulator is already there on this. We have around 9 to 10 funds in India. Of course, the money under management is yet to take off, but we have 9-10 institutional mutual funds already in this space. The third thing which was supposed to happen, and that is a big part of this, is the rating of ESG in India, which finally now, post the BRR report submitted to SEBI, and now CRISIL getting into a kind of a ranking system. The third part of what is a normal or an average ranking in the market is also in place. The point I'm making is the stage is finally set for this to take off. And again,
when BRSR comes from 1st April for the first 1,000 companies,
yes,
it will definitely notch up.
Yeah, but if you look, whatever discussions I've had, and what was the surprise is the willingness with which people participated in the report, the willingness in which people came back with the submission in the report in a very short time. And I've been on various forums on ESG because we run an ESG fund. And the pride with which some of the large corporates were displaying their ESG ranking or what they were doing is just setting the tone for what will happen. And as you rightly said, the recognition has to happen, but the regulatory recognition is more than there in India now. It'll unfold quicker than we think, and then the average person on the market or on the street will go from thinking it is fad to core in a matter of 2-3 years, is my personal opinion. But at this moment, from a recognition of ESG, still a long way to go.
Gupta ji, would you agree?
Yeah, I would say I agree to a large extent with Swaroop that till now what ESG was happening is just like I was wearing a collar, additional collar to show that I am different from anybody else. But now it has to be part of integrated approach, because today people are realizing that if they do not go that path, probably 5 years down the line, they will have to pay a price which will be heavier than the price that they will pay now to comply. That is one. The second part is this, that unfortunately, all across the world, there is no way to map the ESG performance of a company in a manner which will be uniform. And because it is more subjective.
But now there is going to be a convergence. No, one of the decisions that COP26 was to create a institute is going to
you're talking on the macro, but I am coming to the micro part of it. Say, for example, if you look at the reports of international agencies, now they take carbon emission as per dollar of revenue. Now imagine the Coal India or any coal company, if they were doing X per dollar last year, this time it will be X by 6. Their emission will be 1/6 of previous year per dollar of revenue because the coal prices have gone up 6 times. So the metrics with which the measurement is taken is not correct. People have not put their mind to that. Unless until we put our mind to that measurement metrics, the problem would happen that I will rate Swaroop as 100 and you may rate Swaroop as 40. So that problem is there. The third and most thing is this, that as I say, you have been in the market, everybody in the market, till 1980s. Most of the promoters used to take money out of the company and show profit at a less. The moment they realize that PE multiple, if they take 100 rupee out, they are getting only 100. But if they keep the 100 rupee in the company and the multiple is 20, so is it 20 times 100 that they are getting. So the moment they understood that concept, they started not withdrawing this money except very few. The moment they get the G premium linked to the PE, and that's why the whole thing, the regulations will not be requiring hammer. It will be voluntary because the P factor is impacting you.
That's correct. No, I agree with that. What role do you think independent directors should play in this ESG dialogue at board? Do you think they are into the conversation or still only really managements that are running it? Because of the reasons that you mentioned.
The question is to me, no?
You and to anybody else.
So I would say I will never separate independent director as another part of the board. I will say board as a whole. It may happen that I have a view on one subject, you may have a view on another subject. So it is a collective. The moment we say that it is separate role for independent director, separate for executive, then probably we are creating an organization.
So there is another development that is happening. Is a lot of boards are thinking of creating ESG committees. So do you think that's a good idea, or let it be a board controlled subject?
No, I would say the ESG committee is a good idea because if there are 9 people in the board, the 9 people cannot be part of a committee to decide. So you got to have a smaller committee which will give the strategic direction that can be discussed in the board and that can become the corporate philosophy. But ESG committee would be a good beginning to start in a very serious and a concentrated manner on the aspect.
Anybody would like to add to this?
Just to add. Yeah, go ahead.
Oma?
Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Oma, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah,
and then
so, yeah, I think one issue which may be useful to think about board composition is whether or not there is an ESG committee. Nomination and remuneration committee might want to keep the skill set of ESG issues while hiring directors. So, for example, if a company is likely to face a significant climate risk, having somebody with that expertise on the board would be helpful. As Mr. Gupta said, the board is a unitary function in the end, but having somebody with the expertise as a component of that would certainly help enlarge that discussion and debate on the board.
Priya,
what has our experience been? So a couple of things. One is, when BRR was in place, not BRSR, and companies had the ability to actually file an integrated report. We ended up finding that compliance of BRR was almost 100%, give or take a few companies of whoever was supposed to file it. But the integrated reporting, not more than 50 people filed. In fact, that also was a little bit of a stretch in that sense. So again, it seems to come back to the point is what is the incentive, frankly. Now this has been mandated. So you necessarily have to have a sustainability chapter. There are some leading indicators which are still continue to be voluntary, etc. So that will happen. IOSCO, I think, has already taken cognizance of the fact that integrated reporting, SASB, each one has their own, way of looking at things, and therefore there needs to be, and COP26 as well, there needs to be some kind of commonsensical and common approach. But from a broader perspective, again, the AUM is much less, and Swarup can attest to that. But the indices that NSE is, the funds that are benchmarked on NSE's indices at least, seem to have performed better by almost 100 basis. Of course, the period of time that we have backtested is relatively small, but whatever this period is, 2 years, 3 years, ESG funds seem to be doing better. So maybe that's the financial incentive, and from a BRSR perspective, that's a regulatory prescription. Hopefully, both will come together to give us better, a better outcome. But the only point which I have to make here, the additional point is sometimes these are very voluble. They don't necessarily, it doesn't necessarily say exactly what we need to look at. I've read integrated reports of quite a few companies, extremely voluble, and there are not enough, pointers to what's important. They go on and on. It's almost like a motherhood statement. I think that we should strongly encourage as exchange. We will do that as well, to come to the crux of what is required to be disclosed, rather than another 100-page document.
Priya, since you said this, I'll just take 2 minutes, Mr. Shroff. When we did the ESG Sector Leader Index with NSE, that is when I realized that you are not only doing good by investing in ESG, but you are making money by investing in ESG. That is as recent as 2-3 years early for me. And when you look at how we've been investing as institutions, where our assessment ends is where ESG starts. And look at Mr. Gupta, nothing for or against. Let us look at, say, diversity right now. Diversity is still a gender thing. But when you project it to ESG, it is a far more inclusive thing than just, you should see just the diversity report of various, or say Sustainalytics or one of those global people who provide this report, is a long journey ahead, right? And then like Priya is saying, I think some amount of what are the important thresholds, which are point number 1, 2, 3, 4 to be considered. I think maybe the regulator will come back and put that in. Once that is in place, then this graduation process will start. And the fact that if it dawns on to people that these are better companies, and there is reason why it's called sustainable. And like I said, the difference is governance. Once that dawns on to people, the change can be pretty quick.
No, that's a very valuable comment. So I know we're running out of time, so I'll just very briefly deal with the last theme of the day, which is compensation. So sort of building on the the compensation part of the presentation made by SES, what does this panel really feel about the direction of executive compensation in corporate India? Is it being fairly done? Is there adequate transparency in a relative context? Yes, it's not. There's not the same level of scrutiny that you have, say, in the US, where most of the debates really are on executive compensation, and we don't have those extreme examples as well. But still, there is a relative context in India. So, how do we feel that this whole the direction of executive compensation, how is it proceeding, considering that the regulations and the policy has all laid down a number of speed breakers in the approval process, majority of minority, all that stuff that has been put in ever since the Kotak Committee report and the LODR and all of that. Has there been some sense brought into the entire discussion? So, Priya, question for you.
I don't frankly think that a lot has happened on the compensation front. Just looking at the report, what you can see is that companies that are more professionally driven, the compensation to even their chairman and executive directors is materially different from what has been given to somebody that's a promoter-driven company. And if we take the averages out, some of the differences are quite stark. You have people getting a whole amount of money to be the executive director of 2 different companies. I would argue that it's one company is difficult enough. two companies is a different animal. So, but it seems to be, and I'm just being very blunt here, it almost seems to me, and if you are a promoter, potentially you can take the money away through a dividend as well. You need not necessarily compensate yourself, but it seems to give some kind of validation. I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but it seems to give validation to people when they pay themselves a lot more than possibly what peers get paid, or what you should get paid, just given the performance of the company. So if there is one area in which I don't necessarily think that a lot has happened, that is in the compensation space. There just seems to be too much divergence and too much of stark differences, and not enough focus on the performance of the company in general, and even from a market perspective.
Well, thanks for that note of caution. Umakant?
Yeah, I agree with Priya. I'm quite surprised that the study showed that promoter-owned companies pay a lot more to their promoter executive directors, which is counterintuitive to what we see elsewhere. So that should never have occurred. So that's something.
But there's no apples for apples. There's no concept of promoter elsewhere.
Yeah, that is true. So as you said, in the other cases, it's paying other outside directors. So you would imagine that you don't need to pay promoters because they have other ways of remunerating themselves from the company. But having said that, I think on the positive side, maybe it's only anecdotal, but it's also interesting to see how there have been say on pay votes which have gone against remuneration. So there have been some recent cases in the last year or two where many proposals for remunerating directors have been defeated by shareholders. Maybe that's the way to go. I think that
usually when Mr. Gupta puts a report,
yeah,
that's when it generally happens.
Yeah. So I think that's really a very positive signal, and that's how it should be. Maybe the market should decide more than the regulators, and if that becomes more of a norm, that's a positive signal.
Gupta ji, anything? Any quick comment?
Yeah, I would say things are changing, although not at the pace which I would have loved to, because what is happening now, some sort of fear has gone down that if the remuneration is really very skewed, probably the investors may hammer the proposal. That fear has gone down, but it is not very effective in the sense because of the ownership pattern is such. There has been a discussion, or rather a point that I have been trying to make, is this: I as an interested party should not be voting for my own remuneration. Today, what is happening, if I own 51% equity in the company, my remuneration can never be defeated because it is always an ordinary resolution. So I can bulldoze my things. The moment I am prohibited from voting on my own remuneration, probably things will change. The second thing is very important is that Mr. Umakant talked about NRC. Now, in my opinion, NRC has failed very much in doing its duty, because how can NRC justify that they pay to themselves 1 lakh rupee commission and they pay 10 crore or 20 crore or 30 crore commission to the promoter non-executive director? I always say that if you feel that you are 1/3, 300 of capability of other director, please go and resign and sit at home. But if you are comparable to promoter non-executive director, then seek the same compensation or almost equal compensation. That problem is there, and that's why NRC has failed in doing its duty.
Kind of last question for this. I have a number of them, but I know we are now seriously over time. Just a last thought on linked with some of the conversations that are going on these days on, rewarding oneself by ESOPs or by preferential allotments. So there's one line of thinking which is that promoters should not, or promoter managers should not be allowed to get ESOPs or preferential allotments. And the other is, of course, that so long as it is meeting with the regulations, there is no problem with it. So what does this panel feel about compensation through equity? And what are your, then this is not cash compensation, this is in kind through shares or ESOPs. what does this group feel? Because at one level also, this is a very important sort of aspect of, as we move to a $5 trillion economy, you need to have the best talent, you need to compensate the best talent. And if you're going to create excessive kind of hair around fair market link compensation, then you may be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So there are strong arguments on both sides, and we should not look at it only with one lens. So thoughts and observations on this?
Maybe I'll start off. I'm not in favor of a total prohibition against that. Through compensating through preferential allotments or other methods. The easiest thing is to say that let's kind of ban that altogether. But maybe we need to introduce more checks and balances to ensure fairness, arm's length transaction, as if the same thing could have happened with any other unrelated party. So long as you have this, maybe independent fairness reports given by independent valuers, so build in a lot of checks and balances. I would ultimately leave it to the market with these checks and balances, rather than to say, let's not do this at all, because that will take away the necessity of flexibility for the market and innovation.
Couple of things. No, not actually, but just on what we're seeing from the COVID time, there have been a lot of promoters, whether or not they're managers of their company, they've actually put in money as well. So to actually say that promoters, just because they're managers of their company, should not have a preferential allotment might actually impact the company adversely. Secondly, from a broader perspective, if that company is creating wealth for not just for itself, its employees, but for the larger ecosystem, then surely the competent managers should be rewarded, especially if they have a sustainable business, right? Because many of these...
So that's a market thing. The market will...
Exactly.
And if something wrong is going on, Mr. Gupta will write a report.
And he will make sure that, we all react in 48 hours.
Yeah.
That is the other part.
But I would add, see, my point is this, that today you have created a class that promoter executive director is not entitled for ESOP, whereas a non-promoter executive director is allowed ESOP. So what happens if I am a non-promoter executive director, you give me 1 crore cash and you say 4 crore is in the form of ESOP, which you will do it in 3 years or 4 years. Whereas since you as a promoter is not allowed ESOP, you say because Mr. Gupta's remuneration is 5 crore, I also take 5 crore or 10 crore. So your compensation as the executive promoter director is all in cash, whereas mine is risk related. Whereas you do not prohibit promoters to issue preferential. So what happens? I take hefty remuneration here also, and I can get a preferential allotment also. So I'm saying if you can give me as a promoter preferential allotment, there is nothing wrong if you can give me ESOP as well. That means at least there will be one parity between executive of promoter and non-promoter both. So their remuneration system will be uniform. That is what I am asking.
Fair enough. So I had no more sort of panel questions. I don't know, sort of back to you, Tirthankar, in terms of, do you want to take audience questions or for the panel?
I think in terms of the time that we have, we don't have any questions at the moment. But if there are any, Cyril, you covered the questions. I mean, covered the observations from all the panelists quite well. So from that perspective, I think we are at the end of our presentation today. We had 2 excellent reports, 2 very timely reports, and as Mr. Mohanty from SEBI said, some things, analysis like these, empirical analysis like this, need to be updated on a fairly regular basis so as to build up the right amount of data on which sensible analysis could be made. We also saw a lot of, I would say, optimism about the future. I remember what Swaroop said about how things will change on ESG, especially in the next 2 to 3 years. Certainly, some of the numbers on the compensation report were not healthy. The massive difference that one saw, especially on gender, simply did not make sense. One can only hope things will change, in future. We are on the right path in that sense. So from the next steps perspective, both these reports would be put up on the NSE website for public consumption and comments. Mr. Gupta, I'm sure you will receive feedback on these reports. I think they have to be taken with some seriousness. Mr. Mohanty also said he had shared key takeaways from the report that we had shared with him with the important persons at SEBI, but the final versions of the report will also be actually shared with SEBI. So on that note, I think after a good presentation, after an invigorating panel discussion, for which I thank everybody, especially Mr. Shroff. You conducted the discussion so well, putting in really some very important questions and important topics that needed to be discussed. I thank you all. I thank Mr. Mohanty from SEBI. I thank all the panel discussions, Mr. Shroff, Mr. Gupta, Mr. Umakant Varotil, Amit Tripathi, Sarup Mohanty, and last but certainly not the least, Priya, your department actually is responsible for the reports, ma'am. Thanks a lot. Thank you, everybody, ladies and gentlemen. We bring this session to a close. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, and thank you, NSE, for giving SGS the opportunity.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.